having trouble thinking of something funny to say here. I guess I'm coming up a bit short on jokes for this project. I feel like these panels might have a vertically challenged sense of humor. No worries though, they can always look up to the full-size panels for inspiration. Well, I feel that this intro has really heightened this video, and that I hope that it can inspire others to soar to new heights in building their haunt. Did I just use the same pun twice in one sentence? Maybe. But complaining about it now is going to be too little, too late. Time to get to work. Today, I'm going to use these 3 sheets of 1/4 inch ACX plywood, along with this 4x6 beam that is 8 feet long, as well as these 10 2x4s that are also 8 feet long, 2 of which have a rough beveled edge, these 2 2x2s that are also 8 feet long, and this 2x6 to make a section of short hallway that can be used in a haunted house attraction. I've already made a video about building basic wall panels, which can be found here. And I've also made a video about building basic actor door panels, which can be found here. Links for all of my wall panel videos, as well as a playlist for the basics of building a haunted house, can be found in the description below. To start, I'm going to cut the lumber for my 2 sidewalls and ceiling tile to the lengths that I'll need. I cut 4 boards at 66 7/8 inches, 4 boards at 48 inches, 2 of which have the beveled edge, 6 boards at 45 inches, 1 of which will have a beveled edge, and 1 piece of the 4x6 beam at 45 inches. I also cut the 2x6 into 3 pieces at 24 inches, the 2x2 into 2 pieces at 55 inches, 2 2x4 pieces at 51.5 inches, and 1 2x4 at 24 inches. With all of the lumber cut to length, it's time to start treating the bare wood for fire prevention. Where I am in California, the fire marshal is usually the person who has final say on what will pass safety-wise. This means that just about everything that goes into my haunted attraction requires some level of fire prevention to be added to it. I start by laying out 2 sheets of plywood and laying a third over top of those. This way, any overspray when I'm spraying the edges will go onto another sheet of plywood instead of being wasted on the ground. With the first sheet fully fire treated, I move on to fire treating the lumber. I make sure that all 4 sides of each board get treated, allowing the chemical to fully absorb into each side, as well as I mark everything with a C so that I can keep track of what side had already been coated. Also, as I spray the boards over top the plywood, I constantly move them around so that the overspray doesn't keep coating the same spots over and over again. Per California State Fire Code, if a local fire marshal wants to verify that something that I made meets fire prevention regulations, they can request that I make a sample for testing purposes. The sample is to be representative of how everything has been fire treated. It is explicitly stated in the code that they are not allowed to torch one of my completed panels to test its code compliance. These codes can change state to state, even city to city. Check what your local regulations are before building anything. A fire marshal does have the authority to shut down a haunted house if what has been built doesn't meet regulations, so always stay on the good side of a fire marshal. Unfortunately, across the United States there is no uniform code for what is and isn't acceptable. What it really comes down to, what the individual person who is the local fire marshal decides makes them feel like what has been built is safe or not. Some marshals can be far more strict than others, so good luck! Personally, I haven't had anyone be too terrible to me so far. That's probably in part because I looked up my local code and educated myself on the relevant regulations. That way, when I approached them, I didn't come off as some blithering idiot who is building a death trap. It's better to work with the fire marshal than against them, and showing up knowing the right things to do can go a long way. Speaking of fire prevention, I'm going to show how I mix up a gallon of paint with an additive that makes the paint a protective barrier. Per the instructions on the bottle, I first measure out 4 fluid ounces and pour it into an empty quart can. I then pour off some paint from the gallon into the quart to make room in the gallon. I then measure out 12 fluid ounces and pour it into the gallon. From there, I mark the lid as mixed, and I usually go back to the hardware store and ask them to mix it in their paint shaker. From here, all the paints that I use have had the additive included. Next, I paint everything on all 6 sides with a single heavy coat of deep tint primer. When I'm painting on the final coats of black paint, it's so much easier to cover up than the plain white primer with no pigment in it. This dark gray color is the darkest that I can get the primer to be tinted. Personally, I prefer the backs of the panels be painted black, so that they fade into the darkness at night and not detract from the things that I want the guests to notice. However, that doesn't mean that I can't paint an experience-enhancing decoration on the backs of panels, I just choose not to. I usually make facades as separate pieces that are temporarily attached to the backs of the panels. This way, when I mix up my floor plan for my haunt every year, I don't have to worry about which panels have the backs painted with a decoration for the entrance of the maze. With all of the lumber fully painted, it's time to move on to cutting the plywood down to size. Next, I take 2 sheets of plywood, lay one on top of the other, line them up perfectly, clamp them together so they don't shift, and then cut them into sheets that are 64 inches tall. The smaller 32-inch pieces will be used to cover the gap above the ceiling tile. If that didn't make sense, I'll show what I mean later in the video. I then cut the third sheet in half to make 2 pieces that are 4 foot by 4 foot. The extra 4 foot by 4 foot square will be set aside for later or used on a different project. With the plywood cut to size, I can now paint the rough side of the ACX with a heavy coat of deep tint primer. For those who don't know, there's ACX and CDX plywood. The ACX has an overall smoother finish than the CDX. This makes the ACX a bit more expensive than the CDX. ACX plywood also has one side that is a bit nicer and less knots than the other side. Sometimes when I make panels, the knots are preferred. However, since I don't know how the fronts of these panels will be decorated, I'm going to stick with using the nice side for the front. After painting the plywood with one coat of primer, I move on to painting over everything with one coat of flat black paint. To help prevent water from being absorbed into the porous ends of the plywood, I also make sure that all of the edges are thoroughly coated as well. After making hundreds of panels similar to this, I've found that it's easier to paint everything separately for these first few coats instead of trying to paint it after it has been assembled. The first board that I'm going to use is a 48-inch 2x4 with the bevel. I place it on my sawhorse with the bevel facing up and towards the top of the panel. This will be the bottom of the frame. Next, I check the boards for any curve, and I place them so that the curve will bulge out past the edge of the plywood. I found that it's easier to clamp the boards and push them in to match the size of the plywood than it is trying to pull them outwards towards the edge so that they line up. To assemble the 2x4s together, I drill 3 pilot holes on the ends of the 48-inch board to help prevent them from splitting, and I use 2 nails and 1 screw to hold the boards together. Since these panels get moved around twice a year, the joints get quite a bit of stress on them. The 2 nails are for strength, and the wood screw is to keep them from coming apart. I also use a bit of foaming Gorilla Glue on every joint for a bit of added strength, as well as to help prevent dirt and moisture from getting in between the boards. Next, I mark both side 2x4s with 3 marks, each at 32 inches and 64 inches. Then using my speed square, I draw lines on the outermost marks on the inside of the 2x4s, and the center mark gets a line drawn on the outside. Using an 1/8 inch drill bit, I drill 3 pilot holes along each of the center lines. Next, I use one of my 45-inch 2x4s without a bevel and secure it into place in line with the 32-inch marks that I just made. After building tons of these things on my own, I've gotten pretty good at assembling them without assistance. A way that I make it easier on myself is to clamp a piece of flat bar or a scrap piece of wood onto one side and use it to rest the 2x4 on while I hold the free end in my hand and nail it into place. To make the top of the panel, I'm going to use 2 of my 45-inch 2x4s. One will have a bevel on it and one won't. I'm going to attach them together in an L shape. The board with the bevel will be on the bottom and have the other attached perpendicular to the top. When securing them together, I use a combination of screws and nails, and I take extra care to make sure that they're lined up perfectly. The vertical 2x4 will be the way that I attach the ceiling tiles to the sidewalls. See? Perfectly lined up. With the two boards attached together, I can secure them into place with the rest of the frame. When placing it, I line up the board that has the bevel on it with the lines that I drew at the 64-inch height from earlier. With everything lined up just right, I put 2 screws and 4 nails into each 2x4 on each side. I take extra care to line these boards up with the side 2x4 since it'll be an attachment point for the ceiling tiles. With the frame complete, it's time to flip it over and attach the plywood. When I build a frame for a panel, I always place the boards so that the side that will get the plywood is facing down. Since gravity historically pulls everything down, I've found that it's easier to make the 2x4s flush on the bottom side. Just like with everything else, I apply a bead of glue to the entire frame. I start attaching the plywood by lining up and securing the 2 bottom corners in place first, and then fully nailing it down to the bottom 2x4. Next, I place a clamp on the 32-inch marks on either side, and pull the plywood and frame into alignment with one another. I also use the clamp as a guide when nailing down the plywood to the center board. With the sides of the bottom half nailed down, I move the clamp up to the 64-inch marks and complete the same process as before. Lastly, I put screws into all 4 corners and one directly in the middle at the top. I don't exactly remember why I started doing this, but at this point it's just a thing that I do now. Next, I'm going to build the ceiling tile. To make the frame, I picked 2 48-inch and 2 45-inch boards from my stack of lumber. All 4 boards do not have a bevel on them. I arranged them on my sawhorses with the 45-inch boards placed between the 48-inch boards on each end. I then pre-drill the ends of the 48-inch boards like I did on the first panel. Each corner then gets a bit of glue and the same 2 nails and 1 screw. The frame then gets a bead of glue all the way around the top, and I nail down the plywood, making sure that I don't put a nail at the 1 foot mark from each corner in each direction. I use clamps to line up the plywood with the frame, as well as I use a smaller clamp and a block of wood to pull the 2x4 out to match the edge of the plywood. And with that, the ceiling tile is done. Next, I'm going to build the second side panel, but this one will be a bit different than the first. The basic construction of the bottom 2/3 is the same. The difference is going to be the board that I use for the top. The previous side panel is what I would call an outside panel, meaning that no other ceiling tiles can attach to the back of it. This panel will be an inside panel, meaning that it's built so that ceiling tiles can be attached to both the front and back of the panel. The reason for this is, if I had the short section of my maze do a U-turn, I can easily have the ceiling tiles attached to either side of this panel. On the first side panel, I attached 2 2x4s together in an L shape to make the top attachment point. For this one, I'm going to use a solid 4x6 beam. I attached the beam to the frame by pre-drilling 9 holes into the side 2x4s and using 5 nails and 4 screws on either side to secure it into place. The reason that I don't just use these beams for every side panel is because a single 8-foot beam is twice as expensive as 2 8-foot 2x4s. One 8-foot beam will make the tops of 2 side panels, and 2 2x4s also make the tops of 2 side panels. Also, these beams are substantially heavier than the 2 2x4s. So the dollar cost savings and the weight savings are worth a little bit of extra work to only make as many inside side panels with the expensive beam as necessary. With the frame complete, I ran a bead of glue over the entire thing, placed the plywood, and started nailing it down. I made sure not to place any nails at the 1 foot and 4 foot marks on either side or on either panel, because that's where the attachment bolt hole will go, and I don't want to have to drill through any unfortunately placed nails. And with that, the ceiling tile and 2 side panels are done. I accidentally made the side 2x4s too long on the outside panel, so I used my speed square and my circular saw to trim them down. I'm going to take a moment right now before I continue on with this build to briefly mention my Patreon. I'd love to work on some bigger and much more elaborate projects and share them with all of you. So if you liked this video or found any of my other projects to be helpful or inspirational, please consider contributing. The link, as always, is in the description. Next, I'm going to build the transom, which will go above the edge of the ceiling tile at the start of the short hallway section. This will cover the view of the tops of the ceiling tiles from guests. I start by trimming down the plywood by 1/2 inch. I'm actually going to have to build 3 different transoms. Each one will serve a different purpose. This first one will be for attaching 2 full 8-foot panels in parallel with the 2 side panels of the short hallway. To build the frame, I used 2 2x2s and 2 of the 24-inch long 2x6s. Just like with the rest of the build, I pre-drill the holes and use nails, screws, and glues to attach everything together. With the frame built, I mark on each 2x6 where the edge of the plywood should be, run a bead of glue over the entire thing, and nail down the plywood. With the plywood nailed down, I flip the panel over, use an angle grinder to grind down any nails that are sticking out the other side, and touch up the paint with additional primer. With the first version of the transom done, I can start building the second one. To build this version, I used 2 2x4s that are 51.5 inches long, 1 2x6 that is 24 inches long, and 1 2x4 that is also 24 inches long. This transom is the intermediate version that is for attaching 1 full-size panel in parallel with one side of the entrance of the short hallway and the other perpendicular to the entrance. Additionally, each transom has a frame that is a bit smaller vertically than the plywood. This extra plywood lip will hang low enough to cover the 2x4 frame of the ceiling tile and make a near seamless transition between the 2 pieces. To make the frame square to the plywood for this panel, I secure down the corners first and then nail down the rest. With that transom done, it's time to make the third and final piece of this build. For the frame for this transom, I used 2 2x4s that are 48 inches and 2 2x4s that are 24 inches. Just like with everything else, I flip the frame over and nail down the plywood. So I made a little goof earlier in the video with this plywood. I mentioned that I trimmed off 1/2 inch to the short side. Ultimately, I should have left it as the full 48-inch width. The first transom that I made is the only one that should have been made with the 1/2 inch trimmed off. And the second one should have been made with just a 1/4 inch trimmed off. With all of the pieces built, it's time to finish painting everything. First, I chisel off and sand down any glue squeeze out from the top. Then I sand off the glue squeeze out from around the edges and clean off the dust with my air compressor. I then flip the panel over, grind off any nails that took a detour through the 2x4s, and then paint all of the gray 2x4s with a heavy coat of flat black paint. Now that the 2x4s are painted for that panel, I can repeat the process for the other sidewall, ceiling tile, and the 3 different transoms. For any woodworkers out there, I'd like to quickly address an issue that you may be having with the way that I've made these panels. I do realize that when I paint the plywood and 2x4s first, before gluing them together, that I'm not actually gluing the wood together, but rather I'm gluing the paint on the surface of the wood together. I'm sure that you'll be very happy to find out it doesn't matter. I've been making panels like this since 2009. I've made and remade hundreds of them this exact same way, and at the time of making this video, I have panels that are 16 years old that are still solidly glued together. I also have panels where the glue has separated. What's the difference between the two? Taking care of them. The panels that are still glued together have been well cared for and kept in storage away from the weather and the elements. The panels that didn't hold up as well were left outside in the sun and the rain. Additionally, repainting the backs of the panels every 3 or so years keeps the water barrier fresh so that the moisture doesn't get to the materials underneath and degrade them. I do understand that painting the wood before gluing goes against the way a woodworker does things. But I'm not making a fine piece of oak furniture to go in someone's home. I'm making mass-produced stage flats that will be outside for a few months each year, and I need to make them last. The main reason that I paint everything before assembly is because on the off chance that the glue does separate, the now exposed gap will have paint covering it, and any dirt or moisture that gets into that crack won't cause the bare wood to rot or grow mold. Any exposed bare wood or organic material that has any moisture on it when the panels are put into storage will cause mold to form in the off-season. So taking a few extra steps during the build process will save me tons of time, work, and money in the future. With the flat black coat of paint finished on all of the pieces, I move on to painting everything with 2 coats of semi-gloss or gloss black paint. The reason that I do a coat of flat paint first is because the original panels that I made were done with a flat paint on the back. Unfortunately, I had to find out the hard way that flat paint is prone to growing mold and mildew when in storage. I ended up painting over the flat paint on those original panels with a gloss. Ever since then, I coat everything with a flat paint first and then use a gloss for the final coats of paint. If the original panels had 1 coat of flat paint and 2 coats of gloss, why not just do everything else to match? Plus, it can't hurt to have the extra layers of fire protection as well as water protection. With the first coat of semi-gloss done for all of the pieces, it's time to finish up the painting with the second coat. Let me know in the comments if you like these basic project builds that I do, or if you'd prefer to see me make more specific projects like the giant gingerbread men or man-eating plant prop. I've also been considering making a series of videos that detail some tips and tricks as well as some of my experiences in producing a professional haunted house event. So if that's also something you'd like to see me do, let me hear from you. With the majority of the painting complete, it's time to drill the bolt attachment holes into the sides and tops of the panels. I start with the ceiling tile. On all 4 sides, I measure at 1 foot and 3 foot from each edge and make a mark. I then make a line in the middle of those 2 marks, measure 1 3/4 inches from the back of the 2x4, and drill a 7/16 inch hole. For each of the 2 side panels, I measure up from the bottom of the frame 1 foot and 4 foot. I then measure again from the back of the 2x4 1 3/4 inches and drill a 7/16 inch hole. These are the same measurements that I use to drill the attachment holes on all of my panels. This way, the attachment points are universal across all of my panels, and I can attach any one panel to another panel. Before I drill the holes at the tops of the side panels, I quickly finish the last little bit of painting that I didn't do earlier. With the painting finished, I can drill the attachment holes at the tops of the panels. I measure up from the bottom of the frame 66.5 inches on either side and make a mark. I then measure from each side 1 foot and 3 foot and make marks. I then mark the middle of those 2 measurements and drill a 7/16 inch hole. And with that, all of the pieces are finished and ready for assembly. Just like in my original basic panel build video, I'm going to show a relatively unedited look at how I assemble these panels. I start by setting the first side panel in the approximate spot that I would like for it to end up. I then tilt it onto its side and using 2 4-inch long 3/8 inch bolts with washers, I bolt the outside panel to the ceiling tile. I always thread the bolts so that the extra threads are towards the inside of the ceiling tile. This way, the excess threads won't be sticking out where anyone could get caught on them. I chose to assemble these panels on their side because it's the safest way I can put together an entire section of hallway like this on my own without risking injury by trying to balance anything overhead. Next, using two 6-inch long 3/8 bolts with washers, I bolt the inside panel with the beam at the top to the other side of the ceiling tile. Once all of the bolts have been tightened, I tilt the assembled section of hallway upright. And there it is, it's all done. Well, almost. I whipped up these narrow panels to demonstrate how the short hallway attaches to some full-size panels with the transoms in place. These panels bolt on just like any of my other standard panels would, by using two 4-inch long 3/8 inch bolts. Lastly, I attached the transom to the full-size panels with two more 4-inch bolts. It took a little bit of wiggling, but I got it to fit. Here is a completed section of short hallway which I actually used in a haunted house last year. I also set it up with one panel in parallel and one panel going perpendicular. This setup demonstrates how the two outside full-size panels can be attached perpendicular to the short hallway. I also hopped in one of my prop wheelchairs to demonstrate that it's even accessible for my differently abled guests. The last demonstration that I'm going to do is assemble an additional ceiling tile and outside panel to the back of the inside panel. For this, I'm going to replace the 6-inch bolts with two 7.5-inch bolts. And that's how I built a basic short hallway for my haunted house attraction. Lastly, for those of you who skipped the entire video to watch the reveal at the end, if you liked this video or found it helpful, please consider supporting my Patreon so that I can continue to make more awesome projects like these. I hope that this build was helpful or inspirational. If you like this, consider watching one of my other panel builds or check out one of my other projects. With that, I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching!